Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll end up with a much better grasp of the title at hand, all while learning to read everything else a little bit better. I'm Kimberly Ford, best-selling author, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, editor and PhD in Spanish and French literature. And for those of you who don't exactly traffic in rare books, Foxed Page might be kind of a mystery. Foxing is simply those little kind of brownish dots that you'll see on the pages of very old, very beloved books. The book we're talking about today, though, is not old and it is not beloved. What it is super creepy. It turns out that this is a psychological horror book, which I should have known because of the movie, but I just did not actually know. So we're talking about Elena Ferrante's The Lost Daughter. And as always, the lecture today will be in 3 parts. In the first part, in which there will be no spoilers, we're going to talk about why I think you should read this book. We'll do a quick little biographical thing about Ferrante. We're going to dive into the first paragraph, which is a doozy. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the names. So for anyone right now who is watching the YouTube channel and is seeing this lecture visually and listening, you can see that I'm sitting in front of a mirror. I'm actually in Los Angeles at my brother's house, and I'm in one of my niece's bedrooms. I was so happy when I walked in because, first of all, this place actually looks like an apartment that you might rent in a very nice little seaside town in Italy. But I also was so happy I had forgotten about these closet doors. And what I really love here is this proliferation. So you can see me, but you can also see another image of me behind me. So when we first started recording, I had this sense of like, wait, this is going to be perfect because we have this sense of me essentially proliferating, very much like the characters and the names and the children and the pregnancies in the book itself. Okay. Then in the second section, we're going to talk about the creepiness of the book, which we're going to kind of dive into this essentially like what these creepy elements are. There's several of them. And then what she's doing with them, why the notion of a psychological thriller is important, why this book takes that form. Then we're going to talk, at that point, we're going to talk more in depth about this proliferation of mothers, of daughters, of dolls. There's all sorts of creepy stuff that's proliferating in this book. In the last section, we're going to talk about one doll in particular. We're going to talk about maternity and what I think is sort of the broader message of the book. Ferrante has written a book that's actually fairly open-ended. If you have seen the movie by Maggie Gyllenhaal, you know that the ending of the movie is also quite open-ended. I did a lot of reading. I listened to a lot of interviews, as I always do before I record my lecture. And frankly, I listened to some stuff that was pretty sloppy. So those of you who have listened to me talk ever about Daniel Mendelsohn know that when I think about literature, I don't exactly think about it as a science, but I certainly do think about it as something that needs to be taken seriously. And when I say it needs to be taken seriously in this regard, I simply mean that if you have a thesis or if you have a concept about something that you have read, you need to make sure that all of the data are backing up what you are saying and that there isn't any data that runs contrary to your thesis. So I had quite a bit of data that was running contrary to quite a few theses out there. So I'll be very happy to share my deeply researched thesis with you. I'm not going to sort of, force one certain interpretation on you, but I'm certainly going to give you the one that I see as supported by the most amount of evidence. And then we are going to talk about the end of the book. So most of you, I think, have read the book by now. You may not have finished it. But those of you who've gotten to the ending, you have a treat in store for you today because this is the book of all of the ones that I've done in these lectures. This is the one that I think is most interesting to go back to the beginning. It's essentially a very circular book, and you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you finished it and then went right to the beginning, which is often something I will end up doing. So we'll have in the end of the third session, we will talk about the close of the novel. Okay, why is it I think you should read this book? So I'm going to be very candid and say that the whole Elena Ferrante craze really passed me by in the sense that I read my brilliant friend right when everybody was talking about it, which was a long time ago. And I did not love it. Left me a little cold. I didn't understand the sort of the hype around it. And then, because I have such a shitty memory, I promptly forgot why it was that I did not like that book. And so I was thinking to myself, I should go back and revisit the Ferrante and figure out what it was about it that wasn't sitting well with me. I was devising an itinerary for travelers to Italy. And I was thinking, well, Ferrante is such a hit that, she should be on that list. But I did not feel great about putting the Neapolitan cycle, which is all of her books that are set in Naples, which is where she was born, maybe. We're about to get to her bio, which is interesting. But I didn't really want to recommend one of the Neapolitan cycle. And so instead I thought, well, I'll read The Lost Daughter, because I loved the movie by Maggie Gyllenhaal. It was perfect. If you haven't seen the movie and you have read the book, I highly recommend it. Olivia Colman is unbelievably good, as is Jessie Buckley. Both of them got Academy Awards. Olivia Colman plays the older woman, Leda, and Jessie Buckley plays the younger version of Leda. And just both of them are really deserving of their nominations. And it's just an incredibly well-crafted movie. And frankly, it's much, much richer if you have already read the book. Okay, so partially I am recommending that you read this if you're interested in Ferrante, or if you happen to be going to Italy and you are, you're wanting to sort of check out the Ferrante craze. But if you also want a book that's not super, super long. So this book, The Lost Daughter, is only about 140 pages. Technically, it is a novella, which I love because it's, we've talked in the past about shorter novels and certainly about short stories and absolutely about poetry. This idea that when you have a shorter form of literature, every single word is sort of weight bearing. Every single word really, really counts. So, if you have War and Peace, there's going to be, the occasional misstep, or, in David Copperfield, there's maybe a scene or two that are not quite as well worded and quite as well sort of turned as some other scenes. But in a book this short, and one that is so tense, you're really, you're going to have very high expectations for the prose. And for my money, Ferrante really delivers. I'm also going to recommend this book because the movie is so great. It's not very often that I see a movie first and then go back and read the novel and have both of them hold up the way that they did. So if you're interested in The Lost Daughter as a film, or if you saw it and are considering reading the book, you definitely, definitely should. The other reason why I wanted to, recommend this is because this is an incredible, incredible analysis of maternity. So I am a mom. I have 3 kids. I'm 53. They are now 21 and 23 and 25. So almost exactly the ages of the children of this woman, Leda, who is in Italy. And a lot of the struggles and a lot of the sort of darker parts of maternity, which I think historically haven't really been brought to the fore. I think now in literature, a lot of really sort of harsh and really dark mothering stories are coming, sort of bubbling to the surface in a really good way. But this is one that is done with such incredible literary flourishes. It flourishes in the best of ways. It's really gripping. It's well structured. It's intriguing. It's a page turner. So it's really something that I think tackles a very, very large issue. But does so in a way where it's not, none of the prose is kind of suffering because of the large sort of theme that she's tackling. So I wrote my dissertation on the maternal voice in the novels of Carmen Martín Gaite, who is a Spanish novelist who wrote in the last half of the 20th century. And so this was really, really interesting to me because it shared a lot of the different things that I was exploring. But it really, this is a woman, Elena Ferrante in this case, is a woman who really, really has done some real thinking, and not just thinking about maternity, but really has some interesting sort of theoretical underpinnings about individuation and about, the ways that mothers and daughters can be enmeshed. It's a very interesting psychological study. Okay, so we've talked a bit about why I think you should read it. If you're not into creepy books, then maybe it's not great. But let me tell you, I kept thinking, boy, if I were on vacation in Italy, I actually would love to read this because it's not kind of your frothy beach read. It's actually something that's very sort of gripping and a little haunting, something you'll definitely think about while you're, on the train to your next destination. Okay, but now we're going to talk about her biography. Then we're going to dive in to the text itself. Elena Ferrante is actually a pseudonym. So she's kind of famously, cagey about who she is. She had this quotation about how she realized when she was going to publish her very first novel that it was going to essentially kind of go off and have its own experience around the world, and she was going to be very distanced and very separated from it. And so she realized that because she had nothing to do with the publication of the book and sort of its life outside of her, that she didn't need her name to be associated with it. We do know from a bunch of different sleuthing. Sometimes I think I'm a pretty good literary sleuth and a pretty good groupie, but a lot of people are really taking this to the next level with Elena Ferrante. Some guy decided it was this one woman in Italy because he'd looked at tons of bank statements and all of this different stuff. So people are getting real forensic about who this Elena Ferrante might be. Interestingly, Helen. So Elena is sort of another version of Helen. And we're going to talk about the significance of Helen when we talk about the myth of Leda and the Swan. I think in English you say Leda and the Swan, which in mythology is a very important character. Okay, so, and then Ferrante, in terms of her pseudonym, this is a name that she chose. So it's a name that obviously she chose for significant reasons. Ferrante means gray, which I think is interesting, largely because I'm assuming here that it comes from Pharos, which means iron. So it's sort of like this iron gray kind of concept. But Pharos also means fierce. So I'm wondering if there is that nuance. I don't know. I did a little research, but I didn't dig in too much to the linguistic piece of this. But I'm wondering if there is a certain kind of ferocity that comes along with her last name. Given this novel, I would not be surprised. Okay, we know that she was born in Naples. We think that her mother was a seamstress. The fact that her mom was a seamstress and was a working person, it doesn't necessarily mean that her dad was out of the picture, but you do have this sense of her mother. This was not like an upper class situation where she could just kind of, kick back. Elena Ferrante also had 3 sisters, as far as people can tell. And she herself was or is a mother. That's another piece of information that people think they have. She seems to have a classics degree, which she wrote one kind of essayistic kind of academic paper that was it seemed very much like she had a classics degree. That's where people made that conclusion. She claims that she writes and she studies and she teaches. It's interesting to me that she says that she writes and studies and teaches, because when we talk about her as having a pseudonym, I have this feeling that she's hiding out, she's some sort of J.D. Salinger off in a bunker writing by herself. But in fact, it just means that she's anonymous. And so it suddenly occurred to me, in fact, that this is a woman who's probably out and about in the world, and she's teaching classes and she's having children. I mean, it could be somebody we all know very well. I can't think of a single Italian woman right now off the top of my head. Maybe it's Isabella Rossellini. Just kidding. It's probably not her. I mean, maybe. But so there's a lot of sort of mystery shrouding Elena Ferrante as an author, which I think is interesting because this is a very mysterious piece of text that we're looking at, and I like the idea of her persona and her authorship as also being somewhat mysterious. Okay, so we're going to now dive into the text itself. I am fascinated by this Europa cover. So those of you who are watching on the YouTube channel can see right now that there's kind of this creepy little doll, and she has her face toward what looks like a wall. She maybe looks like she's porcelain, and she's wearing a little crocheted dress, and it's unbuttoned and kind of all down the back, so you can see her little buns. So we've got this little doll, but the way that the dress is opening down the back and past her butt, you can see the sort of the cleavage of her little buns here. And it is so disturbing, and it's so sexualized in a way that I was like, wow, yikes. And in the movie, I didn't get a sense of some of the sexual overtones that Ferrante is really infusing into the novel. So when I saw the cover, I was like, wow, I think they might have, they might be suggesting something here that's not really as key an element as this cover makes it seem. And then when I read the book, I was like, whoa, they were spot on. So it turns out that I really like this creepy cover, even though, and I love the pink. I'm a fan of pink, and this is like an incredible raspberry. It's really, it's amazing. I would like to know what the cover of the original book looks like, or even just the Italian paperback, because this is obviously the paperback translation that I have here. So the other thing that's important and interesting to me is that the title of the book in Italian is La figlia oscura, which means sort of like the obscured daughter or the dark daughter. If it were Spanish, my Italian is just like almost nothing, but I would know that like la filla, like la hija oscura would mean like more than anything, it would mean the dark daughter. So there is this idea of darkness, which I don't think they mean in terms of skin tone. I think they mean in terms of like dark and stormy, kind of broody and pessimistic and dark in that sense, and as like not sunny. So it's La figlia oscura. So it also means murky. So you have a very different sense of what this title is in Italian. And I would actually love to talk to this translator. I'm obsessed with translation. I would love to hear about the thinking behind, I'm not sure how it would read if it were the obscured daughter. That does not sound great. And the dark daughter, also not so good. So maybe this is, maybe it's sort of like by default, but it does have a lot, it has more nuance, I think. Of course, in this case, the title, I do like it. I think the first kind of conclusion you come to is that it has to do with the little girl who gets lost, the little girl named Elena. But we also have this sense of a daughter as being lost in the sense of our narrator in this case is, she's much older and her daughters have moved to Canada. So there is this sense of having lost them as well. Okay, so we are going to look at page 9. So when we're diving into the text here, we're going to look just right here at the first page. It's kind of no nonsense, there's no, it would be hard to have a dedication. Maybe not. I was going to say it would be hard to have a dedication if you were trying to be anonymous. And I think I stand by that. You might really give stuff away if you start dedicating it to people. But it is interesting to me that it's very, we're just turning a couple of pages. We have this title page and then we get right to it. There aren't parts, there aren't chapter headings. It's very much, it's sort of spare and stripped down. Okay. We're going to dive into the first paragraph, the first all-important paragraph, which is really, in this case, going to point out a lot of things that we should be focusing on. I had been driving for less than an hour when I began to feel ill. The burning in my side came back, but at first I decided not to give it any importance. I became worried only when I realized that I no longer had the strength to hold on to the steering wheel. In the space of a few minutes, my head became heavy, the headlights grew dimmer. Soon, I even forgot that I was driving. I had the impression, rather, of being at the sea, in the middle of the day. The beach was empty, the water calm, but on a pole a few meters from shore, a red flag was waving. When I was a child, my mother had frightened me, saying, "Leda, you must never go swimming if you see a red flag. It means the sea is rough and you might drown." Wow, this is a doozy of an opening, especially if you have finished the book and you can think a little bit about what happens at the end of the book and where we are as we're coming back toward the beginning. So a couple of things that I want to point out right away. This is a first-person narration. So right from the start, we have this woman, and voice is very important. There's a part later where she's on the beach and she's listening to the little girl and the mother, and they're making voices that they sort of have a kind of a baby talk that they do. And then they also have a voice that they use with this doll. And all of these voices in the beginning, she finds very alluring. And then she becomes really sort of repelled and revulsed by them. Revulsed? That is not a word. She feels revulsion. She's repulsed by them. So she has all of these, these strong reactions to voice. And voice is very important. In part, the woman in the book is an academic, and she uses writing. That's sort of how she like presents her ideas into the world, and that is her ambition, is to use words to illuminate literature. So words and voice, both written and verbalized, are very important. So right from the start, you have this sense of having her voice. But the fact that it's a first person narration and that it is faithfully in her perspective, meaning we aren't going into anybody else's perspectives. It's not like we have a chapter that's told from the perspective of Nina. It's all firmly from Leda's perspective. It adds to a little bit of this kind of closed in and sort of claustrophobic sense that we have. We also, importantly, are seeing everything filtered through all of her anxiety and all of her worries and all of her sort of weird neuroses and her weird actions. So again, like you don't, because it's her perspective and it's her rationale and it's her explaining things, even sometimes when actions are very odd, and she'll own the fact that they are odd, you don't have any kind of outside objective sense of what's going on. So I think this first person narration here is very important. The burning in her side is also very important because of what happens at the very end of the book. This is one good thing about a novella, is if a work is only 140 pages long, you can sort of trust the reader to keep this in mind a little bit. I mean, I'm not sure if you remember this part. Certainly, I shouldn't say certainly, because I probably didn't remember because my memory is so terrible. But you would remember that when she's driving here, she sort of forgets she's driving and she drives off the road and has an accident. And then she ends up in the hospital. And this is no spoiler. You know this by the very next page. And in fact, all of her friends from Florence all of her Florentine friends come down and see her, including her ex-husband and her two daughters from Canada. So this is a significant event that's happening at the very beginning of the book, this kind of car crash that she is having. And after the car crash, they realize that the only thing that is a problem with her, strangely, the only issue that she has is this pain in her side, which does kind of make you, well, I have some thoughts about this, which we're going to get to the very end, but you should be thinking to yourself, if she's unharmed, why is it that all of her friends and even her family, who are coming all the way from Canada, are coming around her and sort of shoring her up? So that's a little bit of a mystery that we'll talk about in the third section. Okay, so a little bit further down in the book here, this idea too of not being able to hold the steering wheel. From the beginning, we have this, you can use this driving as a very important metaphor for what is going to be happening in the book. So she's driving herself to a new place. It's also important to realize that, so she's from Florence, well, she's from Naples, which is down south. And there's a real regionalist kind of antipathy in the book. There's the Neapolitan people are known, well, she sees them as being sort of uncouth and brash and, loud and critical and having these huge, big families and being sort of, just not elevated and not, artistic and not, not academic, certainly. So she moves to Florence when she is going to study. But she has come all the way down to the Ionian coast. So the Ionian Sea is like, if you imagine the boot of Italy, it's down below the sole. So it's important to understand geographically that she has come from Florence, which is further up in the north, a real seat of, like, even more so than Rome, of artistry and rarefication and culture. And she has come all the way past Naples and has gone further south. So there is this real sense of her having regressed into this kind of, more southerly person, like her youth, but also of having sort of surpassed Naples and gone even sort of further south toward, toward the ocean and toward, if you think about this sort of migration south as being both like a sort of moving backwards for her, at least that's how she is seeing it, and also a regression back into her childhood. Okay, but this idea, she has driven there, but this idea that she's out of control in the car and that she's crashing the car is very significant, because throughout the entire book, we see her losing control. So this idea of her having lost control and having had a really grave accident that has brought all these people to her, but actually not like suffered many injuries. That sense of her being out of control is one that we can read as something that's sort of a controlling idea throughout the entire novel. And then we have this very interesting thing happening where halfway through the first paragraph, this woman is older. We find out later she's 48 years old. And the beach is empty, the water's calm, which is an interesting, sort of detail here. And yet there's a red flag waving. If you're in California, that often just means like a lot of great white sharks. So, good idea, even if the sea looks calm, to not head out with the red flag. I don't know what it means on the Ionian coast, but it's a little bit eerie that you have, this flag waving, but there's not any sort of visible problems, which is very much like the accident she's going to have. And it's very much like what happens in the book. There's this real sense of kind of invisible threats, because most of the threats are in fact psychological. But then, of course, arguably the most important part of this paragraph is the entrance of the mother into this kind of accident that she's having. So it's a very interesting thing. When I was a child, my mother had frightened me. So as you read that, sort of the way that it's set up grammatically, it's not my mother told me about the red flag and that frightened me. It's a much larger statement on some level than that. She starts with the idea as a child, so kind of like her whole childhood, my mother had frightened me. So it's this big, big statement about her mother being frightening. And in fact, her mother is, pretty abusive in lots of ways, certainly very emotionally abusive, constantly saying she's going to leave, threatening to leave, sometimes leaving. There's a real sense of insecure attachment that has developed. But then the frightening thing is kind of narrowed to this idea that you should never swim when there's a red flag. You might drown. So it's this real, stakes are high here. Like this is a story, if we're talking right at the beginning, about losing control in a car and a pain in the side that is so distracting that she's kind of losing, control of a vehicle. And then this mother who is saying, you may drown. It's a first paragraph. We even only read the first half that is full of threats. It's full of danger. It's full of things that should be like your mom should be fairly, she should be someone who is in fact taking care of you. And instead she's someone who is just pointing out red flags. So it's a very heavy entrance to a book that in fact is very heavy, but it's also very sort of gripping, which I love. Before we wrap up today and before we end this first part of this 3-part lecture on Elena Ferrante's The Lost Daughter, I want to just talk briefly about the myth of Leda or Leda. So Leda is a swan, or sorry, Leda is not a swan. Leda is she's a Greek myth person. What do you call her? She's like a goddess in Greek mythology, and Zeus takes the form of a swan, and in Wikipedia it says that he seduces her. He's also many times people talk about the rape of Leda by the swan, and in fact that really reminds me of The Black Swan, that kind of creepy movie with Mila Kunis and Natalie Portman, which there are lots of echoes between kind of the creepy vibe of that movie and this book, more so than the movie of The Lost Daughter. But Zeus takes the form of a swan and, has intercourse with Leda. And the same night, she also has intercourse with her husband. She then gives birth with these 2 eggs from these 2 men, she gives birth to the eggs split. So she has Helen and Clytemnestra and Castor and Pollux. So she has 4 children who result from this night when she had sex with both Zeus and with her husband. I forget his name. So it's so interesting that in this book that she chooses the name Leda for her main character, because what we see in the book is lots and lots of proliferation. So we have Helen of Troy, the very beautiful Helen, the one married to Odysseus. No, it's Penelope who's married to Odysseus. Anyway, Helen of Troy, she's like the beauty of and I think she's married to Paris. My mythology, not great. But anyway, Helen of Troy, this beauty. You can also translate that into Elena. So you have this idea of Leda and Helen being the daughter, but it also is Elena. And Elena is, of course, Elena Ferrante, but Elena is also the name of the little girl in the book. So we have already, if you know about Leda and you know about these 4 children that she has, you have this idea of proliferation. And we know in the book that the woman Lida has her two daughters, Bianca and Marta. So you have this idea of them as sort of a stand-in for Helen and Clytemnestra. In fact, one of them, Bianca, is very beautiful and is very sort of sweet. And I mean, neither of them is particularly sweet, but she's much sunnier. And then Marta, the younger daughter, is, she had a terrible pregnancy with Marta, and then Marta is kind of bitter, and Marta, is always in the shadow of her older sister. And I think we have a little bit of the shadow also of Helen and Clytemnestra over these two daughters. So I'm going to stop there, but just say that this idea of proliferation is sort of the first thing we're going to dive into in the second installment of this 3-part lecture. So join us at the Fox page for part 2 of our discussion of the Lost Daughter.